A bully slapped a 72-year-old black veteran in a small-town diner. What he didn't know was that the old man's son was the director of Homeland Security, and that slap would shake the entire nation. Morning light spilled through the glass windows of Murphy's diner, catching the steam that rose from fresh coffee cups and the glint of silverware clattering against plates. The place buzzed with the hum of small-town chatter, farmers talking weather, office workers grabbing a quick breakfast before the day began. And then, without warning, the sound of ceramic shattering cut through the air like a gunshot. Brad Morrison had risen from his booth, his construction boots pounding the tile as he crossed the room. He didn't speak at first. He just grabbed Sam Washington's coffee cup and tipped it hard, hot black liquid exploding across the floor, the ceramic mug cracking into pieces at the old veteran's feet. Quarters rolled from the table, scattering like tiny echoes of humiliation. Sam, 72, moved slowly, his cardigan hanging loosely from his shoulders. He did not curse, he did not shout. He simply looked at the broken cup, then back up at the man towering above him. His lips pressed into a thin line, his hands steady on the table's edge. Brad blocked the path to the door, his chest puffed out, the expensive watch on his wrist flashing beneath the diner's fluorescent lights. "Pick it up," Brad growled loud enough for every booth to hear. Forks froze in midair. Conversations died in throats. The diner went silent, a silence that felt heavy, dangerous. Sam shook his head gently. "I won't." His voice was calm, almost too calm, the kind of calm that only made Brad's blood boil hotter. The younger man leaned closer, his breath sharp, his words dripping with contempt. "Say sorry. Right now. Or I'll make sure you never forget this morning." Sam did not move. He straightened his back, looked Brad in the eye, and said quietly, "All I wanted was coffee." That single line sent a ripple through the room. People shifted uncomfortably, phones slid from purses and pockets. Screens lit up. Red record buttons glowed. Brad saw it, and that only made him angrier. He lifted his hand. For one heartbeat the room held still, every eye locked on the moment. Then the slap came. A sharp crack, brutal and fast, across the old man's cheek. Sam's head snapped to the side, his flag pin catching a streak of sunlight as he staggered back. The air left the diner in a collective gasp. Maria, the waitress behind the counter, dropped a spoon. Rodriguez, the fire chief, half rose from his chair. Outside, Tommy Carter's camera lens zoomed tighter against the glass, capturing every frame. Inside, half a dozen phones shook in trembling hands but kept recording. The sound of the slap still hung in the air, vibrating against the walls, impossible to erase. Sam touched his cheek, blood rising where Brad's ring had split the skin. He did not fall. He did not retaliate. He stood with dignity, shoulders squared. But around him the world had already changed. The strike had been caught from every angle, every witness now a storyteller, every second saved in the cloud. And the bully had no idea his life had just been recorded ending in real time. 30 minutes earlier the diner was just another small-town morning, the kind that felt timeless, the kind that could almost convince you nothing bad ever happened in Millbrook. The glass door chimed open at exactly 7:30 and in stepped Sam Washington, cardigan neat, shoes polished, posture steady despite his 72 years. For 3 years he had arrived at the same time, ordered the same breakfast, and sat at the same table with his back to the wall. It wasn't habit, it was discipline. His eyes scanned the exits, his fingers folded the napkin with military precision, every movement quiet but deliberate. Maria, the waitress with tired eyes and a warm smile, looked up from behind the counter and said what she always said, "Morning, Mr. Washington." "The usual?" He nodded. "Black coffee, wheat toast. No sugar, no cream." A simple man with simple needs, at least that's how it looked to anyone watching. But Maria noticed the little things others ignored. The American flag pin on his cardigan that never dulled. The smaller pin beside it from the American Legion, aligned perfectly as if measured. She noticed the way he treated every person in the diner with quiet courtesy, no matter who they were. She had seen his kind before, men who carried dignity like armor. Outside, Tommy Carter adjusted the lens on his camera tripod. A college journalism student, he had picked Murphy's Diner for a class project because it looked authentic, the sort of place where he might catch laughter over eggs and bacon, maybe a handshake between neighbors. He checked his audio, lifted the camera, and caught Sam stepping inside. The professor had told him, capture something genuine. Tommy had no idea just how genuine this morning would get. In the corner booth sat Brad Morrison, already tapping his phone with one hand, smirking at whatever post he had found, his construction uniform crisp only because it was still early. He saw Sam walk in and his face twisted. Under his breath at first, then louder, Brad muttered, "Don't know why they let just anyone in here these days." He wanted to be heard. He always wanted to be heard. A businessman at the next table shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Patterson, the mayor's wife, lowered her newspaper, frowned, then looked away. Nobody said anything. They never did. Brad thrived on that silence. It made him bolder. He leaned toward his companion and sneered louder, "This place used to be for decent folks." Maria's jaw tightened. She poured coffee into Sam's cup as if she hadn't heard a word, but her knuckles whitened around the pot. She had watched Brad's comments grow sharper for months, jokes that weren't jokes, remarks that were really warnings. She had thought about speaking to the manager, but Brad tipped well. Money talked louder than dignity in places like this. Sam thanked her softly, lifted the cup with steady hands, and took his seat. He unfolded the newspaper but his eyes kept glancing at the room, not reading, just scanning. Old habits die hard. He sipped slowly, savoring the warmth. For him this was the closest thing to peace. His phone buzzed. A text. He pulled it out of his pocket, the case scuffed and old but cared for. On the screen was a message that made his lips twitch into the faintest smile. "Dad, big cabinet meeting today. Proud of you, James. Be safe." Sam typed back with one finger, careful and slow. "Proud of you, son." He set the phone down, his hand brushing the purple heart ribbon he still carried in his wallet. Across the room, Brad saw none of that. He only saw an old man counting quarters for his toast, an easy target. He leaned back in his booth, voice carrying just enough to sting. "Some folks don't know when they're not wanted." The words slid through the diner like smoke, choking but invisible. No one answered. Maria's eyes flicked to Sam, then to Brad, then back again. She bit her lip. She wanted to defend the old man, but the risk hung over her like a shadow. Tommy, outside, focused his camera on the window, catching a frame of Sam sipping coffee alone. He thought it looked almost cinematic, like a portrait of small-town America. He couldn't know it was the opening shot of a storm. The light over Sam's table flickered once, a trick of the wiring, but it felt like a signal. The town was about to see what happened when quiet dignity met open hatred. And everyone in that diner was about to become a witness. The diner had begun to thin out. Farmers headed back to their fields, office workers slid their checks across the counter, the traveling salesman tucked his briefcase under his arm and disappeared out the door. By 7:45 only the lingerers remained. Sam Washington sat quietly, sipping the last of his coffee, folding his napkin with neat precision. He reached for his wallet, pulling out worn leather, and placed a few quarters on the table. That was when the scrape of wood against linoleum split the silence. Brad Morrison pushed his chair back deliberately, the sound long and harsh, dragging every eye in the room toward him. His work boots thudded against the floor as he stood. He didn't rush. He wanted the whole diner to see. Maria's hand froze around the coffee pot. Mrs. Patterson lowered her newspaper again. Fire Chief Rodriguez shifted in his seat. Brad walked slowly, his smirk fixed, until he loomed over Sam's table. Then, with one swift motion, he knocked his arm into the coins, sending them clattering across the floor. The quarters spun and rolled, some disappearing under booths, others ringing against chair legs. Brad folded his arms across his chest. "Pick them up," he said loudly. The words dropped heavy into the room. Sam looked at the coins, then at the man towering above him. His jaw tightened but his voice stayed calm. "No," he stood, straightening his cardigan, preparing to leave. Brad shifted to block the path. His shoulders spread wide, his body a wall of intimidation. "Not so fast, old man. You don't walk out without saying sorry. You made a mess in here. Apologize." Sam met his eyes. "I haven't disrespected anyone. I'd like to leave." His tone was level, but his voice carried the weight of decades of discipline. Brad leaned closer, his smirk widening. "You hear that? He thinks he hasn't disrespected anyone. Just walking in here is disrespect." A couple in the corner exchanged nervous glances. Maria's hands trembled as she set down the coffee pot. She pulled her phone from her apron pocket, the camera shaking slightly as she lifted it. She wasn't sure why she was filming, only that something inside her said she needed proof. Sam stepped sideways, trying to pass, but Brad moved too, cutting him off. It was a dance of humiliation, one man trying to leave with dignity, the other determined to strip it away. Brad's voice rose louder with every word. "Say it. Say you're sorry for dirtying this place." Sam's expression didn't change. "I will not." The silence that followed pressed down on everyone. Rodriguez half rose from his seat, his hands on the edge of the table, his eyes darting between Brad and Sam. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He sat back down, shame flickering across his face. A man who fought fires, who commanded crews in chaos, now hesitating in the face of one bully in a diner. Maria's phone caught it all, her breath ragged behind the lens. Brad saw her recording and barked, "Put that down unless you want to lose your job." Maria flinched, but she didn't lower the phone. Her jaw tightened. Brad turned back to Sam, enjoying the silence of witnesses too afraid to act. He pressed his hand on the table, leaning in so close Sam could smell his aftershave, sharp and synthetic. "You don't leave until I say you can." The words were not just a threat. They were ownership, a declaration that Brad believed he decided who belonged in that diner, in that town. Sam exhaled slowly, steadying himself against the table. The years weighed on his bones, but his training steadied his heart. He kept his voice low but firm. "I am leaving." He tried to step past again. Brad's boots scraped as he moved in front, chest puffed, his body shaking with anticipation. This was no longer about coffee or coins. This was about pride, control, the need to perform dominance before an audience. Every second that passed tightened the air until it felt unbearable. Tommy's camera outside the glass caught the tension, zooming in on the way Brad loomed over Sam, on Maria's trembling phone, on Rodriguez frozen halfway to his feet. No one realized yet that history was being recorded from every angle. And in that silence, in that suffocating moment, the town revealed its truth. They had all heard Brad's words, seen his cruelty, but none of them stepped in. Not yet. The diner fell into a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the windows. Sam shifted, moving a step to the side, aiming for the narrow space between the table and the wall. Brad moved with him, blocking the way, his chest nearly touching the old man's cardigan. Their faces were inches apart, one lined with years of discipline and quiet dignity, the other twisted with rage and arrogance. Brad's voice exploded, filling every corner of the diner. "Say sorry, old man. Right now. Or I'll make sure you never forget this morning." His spit flew with the words, his breath hot with fury. Sam did not flinch. His eyes stayed steady, his voice soft but clear. "All I wanted was a quiet cup of coffee." For 1 second the words seemed to hang in the air, fragile but unbreakable. And then Brad snapped. His arm came up in a blur. The open hand cracked against Sam's face with brutal force. The sound rang out like a rifle shot, echoing off tile and glass. Sam's head whipped to the side, his cheek splitting under the heavy ring on Brad's finger. A streak of blood appeared, small but unmistakable. The room gasped as one. Maria covered her mouth but kept her phone pointed steady. Mrs. Patterson whispered a prayer. Rodriguez shoved himself halfway out of his chair, then froze again. And outside, Tommy's camera lens caught the moment in perfect focus. Sam staggered, his hip knocking against the edge of the table. Plates rattled, a coffee spoon clattered to the floor. But he did not fall. He straightened, shoulders pulled back, chin lifted. His breathing was calm, steadier than the shaking hands holding phones all around him. He reached into his pocket. Brad laughed, mistaking the gesture for weakness, for retreat. "What now, Grandpa? Calling the cops? You think anyone's coming to save you?" Sam pulled out a battered phone, its screen glowing in the diner's harsh light. He scrolled with one finger, deliberate and unhurried, until he stopped at a single name. He pressed call. The ringing cut through the silence, one tone, then another. And then a voice answered, strong, authoritative, urgent. "Dad, is everything okay? Where are you? I'll send agents immediately." The entire diner froze. The voice carried through the speaker, filling the space, undeniable. Every witness heard it. Every phone camera captured it. Brad's grin faltered, his face draining of color. "Agents," he whispered, almost to himself. Sam kept his eyes locked on Brad, his voice calm despite the blood still dripping from his cheek. "I'm fine, son. There's been an incident. I wanted you to know before it reaches the news." Maria's hands shook harder, her recording live now to dozens, soon to thousands. Rodriguez muttered under his breath, realization hitting like a blow. The mayor's wife clutched her pearls. The old man they had all seen as defenseless had just revealed a connection no one in that diner had imagined. He wasn't just a veteran. He wasn't just an old man counting quarters. He was the father of the director of Homeland Security. And Brad Morrison, drunk on arrogance and hatred, had just laid hands on him in front of every camera in the room. By 9 o'clock that morning Millbrook was no longer just a quiet town. The incident at Murphy's Diner had cracked open like a fault line and the shockwaves were already spreading far beyond Main Street. Maria's shaky video hit Instagram first, posted in a rush, her caption simple, "This just happened. Pray for Mr. Washington." Within minutes it was shared, reposted, and stitched. The slap, the blood, the calm voice calling his son. Tommy uploaded his footage to YouTube, the higher quality angle capturing every word, every gasp, every frozen face in the diner. His title was blunt, "Racist Assault on Veteran, Victim's Son Responds." It exploded. 50,000 views before noon, 200,000 by mid-afternoon. The comments came like floodwater, furious, supportive, shocked. Brad Morrison's name spread with them. By 10 o'clock his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Old drinking buddies who usually laughed at his jokes now texted him to stay away. His contractor called to cancel the week's shifts. A developer he bragged about working with sent a terse message, "We can't be associated with this." His feed filled with screenshots, his face frozen mid-sneer, captions branding him a coward, a thug. He tried posting a statement online, something about misunderstandings and tensions, but the replies buried him alive. Screenshots of the slap. Side-by-side images of Sam's bloodied cheek and Brad's laughing face. Hashtags grew like wildfire, hashtag respect our elders, hashtag justice for Sam, hashtag Murphy's Diner. Local radio cut into programming with the story. Regional TV trucks rolled into Millbrook by noon, satellite dishes unfolding in parking lots. Reporters swarmed the diner, pressing cameras against the glass. Maria refused interviews at first, her hands still shaking, but the footage spoke louder than she ever could. The police chief's phone rang non-stop. Sheriff Hayes tried to calm reporters with vague promises of an investigation, but the press smelled blood. The mayor called Brad privately, his voice tight with panic. "Lay low, Brad. Don't talk to anyone. We can fix this quietly." But nothing about this was quiet anymore. By lunchtime national outlets were running with the headline, "Elderly Black Veteran Assaulted in Small-Town Diner, Son is Head of Homeland Security." Anchors spoke in grave tones, analysts discussed civil rights, commentators debated what the slap meant about America itself. Sam's face became a symbol. Not just an old man in a cardigan, but dignity under attack. Outside the diner, candles and flowers began to appear. Strangers who had never spoken to Sam lit vigil flames on the sidewalk. Cars drove in from nearby towns, people wanting to stand where it happened, wanting to see the booth, the table, the spot where a line had been crossed. Inside Brad's house the panic grew. His wife screamed at him to turn off his phone. His teenage son slammed the door, embarrassed to show his face at school. Brad paced the living room, hands shaking now, the thrill of dominance gone. Every buzz of his phone was another nail in his coffin. "They don't know me," he muttered. It was just one slap. But the world had already decided. Reporters dug into his past. Old social media posts resurfaced, half-hidden comments about keeping the town the way it should be. Angry rants about outsiders. Photos of him at rallies no one remembered until now. By 2 o'clock the first news alert broke a deeper story. Investigators were reviewing other complaints in Millbrook. A Hispanic man turned away at a grocery. A black family questioned at a community center. Native American veterans forced to show extra ID to vote. The pattern was emerging, ugly and undeniable. This wasn't just one slap. It was a window into something rotten. Sheriff Hayes tried again, calling Sam this time. Her voice was low, almost pleading. "Mr. Washington, maybe we can handle this privately, just between us. The town doesn't need this attention." Sam's answer was steady. "Sheriff, I'm not the one who brought the cameras. They came because truth can't stay buried." The mayor left a message on James Washington's phone in Washington, D.C., hinting at family influence to ease the situation. But James was already in meetings with federal officials, and his answer was simple: there will be no cover-up. By evening the diner itself became a stage. News anchors filmed live from the parking lot. Maria's Instagram following jumped from hundreds to tens of thousands. Tommy's video reached 500,000 views. Strangers commented from across the country, veterans sharing their own stories of disrespect, families posting pictures of fathers and grandfathers who wore uniforms and came home to prejudice. The name Millbrook trended alongside words like accountability, justice, dignity. Brad sat in the dark of his living room, phone finally silent because he had thrown it against the wall. The town he thought he owned had turned on him. Contracts gone, friends vanished, his reputation shredded in real time. Outside, protesters gathered with signs. Some read simply, "We stand with Sam." Others carried the veteran's picture, cardigan neat, flag pin shining. And somewhere in the noise of chants and cameras and breaking news, a more dangerous whisper began to surface. Reporters hinted that Millbrook wasn't the only place. That other towns hid similar patterns. That Brad's slap had not just exposed his cruelty but an entire system that had thrived on silence. What began as a violent morning inside a small diner had become a national reckoning before the day was over. And the storm was only just beginning. The town hall was overflowing long before the meeting began. 400 seats had been set up inside, but nearly twice that many people crowded into the aisles, lined the walls, or pressed against the windows outside where speakers had been rigged. Satellite trucks idled at the curb, their dishes aimed skyward. The glow of television lights mixed with the old chandeliers overhead, casting a strange mix of modern glare and small-town history. For Millbrook, nothing had ever felt this large, this exposed. The moderator called the meeting to order and the room fell into a nervous hush. Cameras swung toward the stage where a massive screen had been erected. The first image appeared. The diner's security footage, grainy but undeniable, showed Brad Morrison crossing the floor, slamming his hand on Sam Washington's table, knocking coins to the floor. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Then the audio kicked in. Brad's voice, loud and ugly, filled the hall. "Say sorry, old man. You don't belong here." The next clip came from Maria's phone. Shaky, close, but crystal clear when the slap rang out. The sound cracked through the speakers like thunder. The hall erupted with shouts, some in outrage, others in shame. And then Tommy's footage played, wide angle, steady, capturing every second from the diner window. The three perspectives formed one undeniable truth. There was no misunderstanding. There was only cruelty. Brad shifted in his seat, his face burning red, sweat beading along his hairline. He tugged at his collar, muttering to his lawyer. When the lights came up, Maria Santos was called to the stand. She walked slowly, hands clasped, but when she spoke her voice was steady. "I filmed because I knew no one would believe me otherwise. I've watched this man belittle customers for months. I stayed silent because I was afraid of losing my job. But silence doesn't protect anyone. It only enables." The crowd applauded, some rising to their feet. Brad's lawyer tried to object, but the sound was drowned in clapping. Next came Fire Chief Rodriguez. He removed his cap before he spoke. His voice broke at first, then grew stronger. "As a public servant, I should have acted sooner. I saw it happening. I saw the escalation. I did nothing. And that's on me. But tonight I will not stay seated. What Brad Morrison did was not a mistake. It was a choice." He turned and faced Brad directly. And we all saw it. The fire chief's words carried more weight than any footage. The hall was buzzing now, the tide shifting against Brad. Then Mrs. Patterson, the mayor's wife, stepped forward. A hush fell again. Her husband sat rigidly in the front row, his jaw locked, but she didn't look at him. She looked at the crowd. "My husband told me it was better to ignore complaints. That speaking up would cause trouble, lower property values, hurt tourism. I stayed quiet because I thought silence was loyalty. But silence is complicity. I cannot protect him anymore. Not when he protected men like Brad." The room gasped. The mayor lowered his head, pale under the lights. Brad stood abruptly, his chair scraping. "This has all been blown out of proportion," he shouted. "One bad moment doesn't erase a lifetime of hard work. I'm not a monster. I'm a man who made a mistake." He spread his arms, as if pleading for sympathy, but the room was no longer with him. One of his own supporters, a fellow contractor, rose from the back. "Brad, I've known you for 20 years. That wasn't a mistake. That was who you are." The man turned and walked out. Others followed. Brad's face collapsed into panic as his base crumbled. Then the screen lit up again. A new slide, projected larger than life. An email. The heading read, "Phase 1 successful." The words beneath confirmed what investigators had whispered all week. 3 minority businesses closed this year. Property values stabilizing. Tourism committee pleased. Maintain pressure for Phase 2 completion. The hall erupted. Some shouted, others jeered, others simply sat in stunned silence. Brad's voice cracked as he stammered. "Those aren't mine. Taken out of context. You don't know the whole story." But the crowd did not believe him anymore. The truth was too clear. The lawyer at his side buried his face in his hands. And then Sam Washington rose. The room fell quiet in an instant. He did not rush. He moved like time itself slowed for him, every step measured, every eye following. He reached the podium and adjusted the microphone with steady hands. The flag pin on his cardigan gleamed under the lights. His voice, though soft, carried to every corner of the hall. I fought for this country when I was young. I wore its uniform. I bled for its flag. I never asked for special treatment. All I ever wanted was the same dignity as every other citizen. He paused, letting the silence work. On Tuesday morning, I walked into Murphy's diner for a cup of coffee, like I've done every week for 3 years. That's all. A cup of coffee. And I was told I didn't belong. His eyes swept across the crowd, not angry, not pleading, simply unwavering. I've faced enemies abroad. I never thought I'd have to face hatred in my own hometown. I don't need revenge. I don't need applause. I only ask for this, that in the country I defended, a man can sit down to drink coffee without being told he is less. The applause began slowly, then swelled into a standing ovation. Tears glistened on faces, strangers clasped hands, reporters wiped their eyes as they filmed. Brad slumped back in his chair, utterly destroyed, the email glowing above him like a verdict written in fire. The climax had come. Justice was no longer a question. It was unfolding in real time, and the bully who once believed he owned the town now sat alone in a sea of witnesses who finally chose dignity over silence. Months later Millbrook was almost unrecognizable. The headlines had faded from national news, but the scars and the lessons remained. Brad Morrison was no longer a looming figure in town. His contracting business folded within weeks, his partners cut ties, and the last time anyone saw him he was walking into a courthouse with his lawyer, face pale, suit wrinkled, eyes hollow. The charges against him were not just local assault but federal civil rights violations, a stain no lawyer could wash away. His wife packed up the house, his children refused to answer his calls, and the man who once strutted across the diner floor now shuffled through life alone, a symbol of arrogance undone. Meanwhile, others rose. Maria Santos, the waitress who once worried about losing her job, became something more. Her testimony and courage turned her into a leader. By spring she was sworn in as the newest member of the town council, elected by a landslide. On her first day she told reporters she would still waitress one morning each week to remember where she came from. Fire Chief Rodriguez, who had once hesitated in the diner, found redemption in action. When Sheriff Hayes resigned under pressure, Rodriguez was elected the new sheriff, promising transparency and accountability. His first official act was establishing a civilian review board for complaints of discrimination. Change came to Murphy's diner too. The old owners sold, unwilling to face the boycotts and the stares. The new management put up a fresh sign above the door, a place where everyone belongs. Inside, the booths were the same, the smell of coffee the same, but the atmosphere was different. People who had once kept their heads down now looked up, greeted each other, shared the space without fear. And on Tuesday morning, as always, Sam Washington returned. Cardigan pressed, shoes polished, he pushed through the glass door at 7:30 sharp. Maria poured his coffee before he asked, but this time something changed. As he sat at his usual table, the room rose. One by one, every person in the diner stood, heads bowed slightly, a silent salute to the man whose dignity had forced them all to confront their silence. Sam nodded back, no smile, no flourish, just the quiet acknowledgement of a soldier who knew respect when he saw it. He lifted his cup, took a sip, folded his napkin. For the first time in months, he was allowed to drink his coffee in peace. The town had moved on, but the story had left its mark. Across America other communities cited Millbrook as proof that small towns could face their ugliness and change. Civil rights groups called it the Millbrook model. And just when Sam thought the storm had passed, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. The number was unfamiliar, Washington area code. He answered. A calm, professional voice spoke. Mr. Washington, this is Detective Angela Foster with the Federal Task Force. We've got another situation involving a veteran. We could use someone who understands dignity under fire. Sam looked out the window, the morning sun spilling across Main Street, the flag pin gleaming on his cardigan. He paused for a long moment. Then he said, "When do you need me?" The fight for dignity, it seemed, was not finished. And Sam Washington was not done fighting. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.